My name is Daniel Foster, and 3 years ago I bought what I thought was my dream property. 4 acres at the edge of a subdivision called Maple Ridge Estates, with a small barn, a pond, and just enough privacy to make the noise of the world fade away. What I didn't fully understand at the time, because frankly I didn't read the title work as closely as I should have, was that a gravel road cutting through the southeast corner of my land wasn't just an old farm trail. It was a recorded easement, granting Maple Ridge Estates the right to use that strip of land as an access route to a retention pond they maintained for drainage purposes. For the first year, that easement didn't bother me at all. Maybe a maintenance truck rolled through twice a year to check the drainage pond. I barely noticed it. I figured the HOA was a distant, mostly invisible entity, the kind of organization that exists on paper more than in daily life. I was wrong about that, and I was about to find out exactly how wrong. It started on a Tuesday morning in early spring. I was out checking on my chickens when I heard engines. Not one truck, several. I walked toward the easement road and found 2 pickup trucks, a small excavator, and 4 men in matching polo shirts that read, Maple Ridge Estates HOA, Community Improvement Committee. They were unloading lumber, bags of rubber mulch, and what looked suspiciously like playground equipment. I asked the man who appeared to be in charge. His name, I'd later learn, was Gary Pruitt, the HOA's vice president, what exactly was going on. He told me, with the kind of breezy confidence that only comes from someone who has never once considered they might be wrong, that the HOA board had voted to build a small community playground on the easement strip. He said the easement gave them access rights, and access rights, in his interpretation, meant they could build whatever they wanted on it. I told him that wasn't how easements worked. An easement for access is not a grant of ownership, and it certainly isn't permission to install permanent structures. I asked him to stop and to show me whatever documentation the board was using to justify this. He shrugged and said the board's attorney had already looked into it, and that if I had a problem, I should bring it up at the next HOA meeting. I should have called the police that day. I should have called my own attorney before the first hole was dug. Instead, I made the mistake so many of us make when something outrageous happens right in front of us. I assumed reasonable people would eventually do the reasonable thing. I assumed that once they understood the legal reality, they'd stop. They didn't stop. Over the following 3 weeks, that strip of land, my land, with an easement allowing only passage, nothing more, transformed into a full-blown playground. Swing sets, a jungle gym, a small pavilion with picnic tables, rubber mulch ground cover. They even ran a buried electrical line for lighting, which meant they'd trench through my property without so much as a phone call asking permission. I want to be clear about something because I know how these stories can sound. I am not a man who hates children, or playgrounds, or communities gathering together. I grew up in a neighborhood with a park 2 streets over, and some of my best childhood memories happened on rusty swing sets. My objection was never to the idea of a playground. My objection was that they built it on my land, against the law, without my consent, and then treated my objections as an inconvenience to be managed, rather than a legitimate legal concern to be addressed. I finally did what I should have done from the very first morning. I hired a real estate attorney. Her name was Patricia Liang, and within a week of reviewing my title documents and the recorded easement, she confirmed what I already suspected. The easement was strictly for ingress and egress, meaning passage to and from the retention pond for maintenance purposes. There was no language granting any right to construct improvements, install fixtures, or create a recreational facility. What the HOA had done was, in plain terms, trespass and unauthorized construction on private property. Patricia drafted a formal letter to the HOA board, outlining the violation and demanding the playground be removed within 30 days, along with restoration of the land to its prior condition. I delivered that letter myself, in person, at the next HOA board meeting, because I wanted to look these people in the eye when they realized this wasn't going away. The reaction was not what I expected. Instead of concern, I got condescension. The HOA president, a woman named Carol Whitfield, told me that the playground had become a beloved fixture for the families of Maple Ridge Estates, and that removing it now would be needlessly disruptive to the children who use it daily. She suggested, with a straight face, that perhaps I should consider donating the easement permanently to the HOA in the spirit of community. I told her that the spirit of community doesn't usually involve building on someone else's land without asking, and that the law was not interested in how beloved an illegal structure had become. Gary Pruitt chimed in to say that since the playground was already built, tearing it down would be wasteful, as if the legality of the situation was something that could be outweighed by the cost of lumber. I left that meeting more frustrated than when I arrived. The 30-day deadline in our letter came and went. No response, no removal, no acknowledgement beyond a single dismissive email from the HOA's attorney claiming that long-standing community use had somehow created additional rights beyond the original easement language, a claim Patricia assured me had no real legal grounding, since the playground had existed for barely a month at that point, and adverse possession or prescriptive easement claims require years, not weeks, along with conditions that clearly hadn't been met. In the meantime, the playground kept getting used, almost defiantly. I'd watch from my kitchen window as families pulled their cars onto the gravel shoulder near the easement, kids racing toward the swings while parents set up folding chairs in what was, legally speaking, my front yard. A few of them waved at me, friendly and oblivious, completely unaware that the ground beneath their children's feet was the subject of a legal dispute. I didn't have the heart to chase anyone off in those early weeks. I kept thinking the HOA would do the right thing before it came to that. I also tried, more than once, to get specifics on exactly how this decision had been made. I requested copies of the board meeting minutes where the playground was approved, curious whether any homeowner had raised concerns about the easement boundary before construction began. What I got back, after some delay, was a heavily abbreviated summary, mentioning only that the committee had recommended moving forward with the community playground project, with no reference to surveys, easement language, or any legal review whatsoever. It became increasingly clear that this wasn't a case of an honest oversight. Nobody on that board had bothered to check whether they actually had the right to build what they were building. They simply assumed that because the easement existed, the land was theirs to use however they saw fit. Patricia explained to me that this kind of assumption is shockingly common among homeowners associations, especially smaller, volunteer-run ones without dedicated legal staff. Board members rotate every year or two, institutional knowledge gets lost, and decisions often get made based on what previous boards did rather than what the actual governing documents say. It didn't make me feel better about my situation, but it did help me understand that this wasn't some uniquely malicious plot against me personally. It was negligence, dressed up as community spirit, and negligence, left unaddressed, has a way of hardening into stubbornness once people are forced to confront it. It was around this time that I learned something that made the entire situation feel even more deliberate. The HOA was planning their annual Founders Festival, a big community event held every June, complete with food trucks, a bounce house, a raffle, and, this was the part that caught my attention, activities centered specifically around the new playground. Banners had already gone up around the neighborhood advertising Family Festival Day at the new Maple Ridge Playground. They weren't just refusing to remove the illegal structure, they were building their entire signature community event around it, doubling down in the most public way possible. I sat with that information for a few days. I won't pretend I wasn't angry. But I wanted to be smart about what I did next, not just reactive. So I went back to Patricia, and we talked through my options. She confirmed something I had begun to suspect. Since the easement was strictly for access to the retention pond, and since the playground itself was not a permitted use of that access, I retained the legal right to control and restrict use of that strip of land for any purpose outside the easement's narrow scope. In plain terms, the access road across my property, the very road people would need to drive on to reach the festival parking near the pond, was still mine to control, provided I wasn't blocking legitimate access to the retention pond for its actual maintenance purpose. I made a decision. I wasn't going to do anything destructive. I wasn't going to tear down their swing sets or cause a scene. I was simply going to exercise my legal right to control access across my own property. On the one day it would matter most, the day of their festival. 3 days before the Founders Festival, I had a contractor install a simple, code-compliant gate at the entrance of the easement road, along with clear signage stating that the road was private property, that access was restricted to maintenance personnel only, and that unauthorized use, including parking and recreational gathering, was prohibited. I also sent a certified letter to the HOA Board, copying Patricia, formally notifying them that I would be restricting non-maintenance access across the easement effective immediately, due to their continued unauthorized use and refusal to remediate the illegal structure on my land. I'll admit there was a part of me that expected another dismissive response. What I got instead was a flurry of panicked phone calls. Carol Whitfield called twice in one afternoon. Gary Pruitt sent an email in all caps demanding I remove the gate immediately because hundreds of families were counting on festival access. I didn't respond to either of them directly. I let Patricia handle all communication going forward because I had learned by then that direct conversations with this particular HOA only ever ended in them trying to guilt or pressure me into backing down. The morning of the festival arrived. I watched from my porch as cars began lining up at the gate, confused families trying to figure out why the road they'd used freely for weeks was suddenly blocked. Some of them got out of their cars and approached, asking politely if there'd been some kind of mistake. I explained, calmly and without anger, that the road was private property, that the playground itself had been built illegally on my land, and that I had every right to restrict access that fell outside the legal terms of the easement. Most people, once they understood the actual situation, were surprisingly understanding. A few even apologized on behalf of the HOA, saying they'd had no idea the playground was built without proper authorization. Of course, not everyone reacted that way. Carol Whitfield showed up in person, visibly furious, demanding I open the gate for the sake of the children. I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that the children were never the issue, and that if she wanted the festival to proceed smoothly, she had a simple option available. Remove the structures that had been illegally built on my land, and we could discuss alternative access arrangements going forward. She didn't have an answer for that. She just stood there, clearly unprepared for the idea that I might actually follow through on something she'd assumed was an empty threat. As the morning wore on, I noticed something I hadn't expected. A small line of cars began forming further down the street, near the secondary common area the HOA maintained closer to the clubhouse. Apparently, in a last-minute scramble, the board had decided to relocate the festival rather than cancel it entirely. Food trucks that had been scheduled to park near the playground were rerouted. Volunteers I recognized from previous community emails were out on the street, redirecting traffic with handwritten signs taped to wooden stakes. It was, by any measure, a chaotic scene, and I won't pretend there wasn't a small, quiet satisfaction in watching an organization that had dismissed my concerns for months suddenly scrambling to fix a problem they could have avoided entirely by simply respecting my property in the first place. The festival, as I understand it, ended up being relocated to the neighborhood's secondary common area, a much smaller, less convenient space than what they'd planned around the new playground. I heard from a few neighbors afterward that it was a noticeably smaller turnout than previous years, and that there was a fair amount of grumbling about the board's handling of the entire situation. Some homeowners apparently spent a good portion of the afternoon asking board members pointed questions about why the festival's centerpiece attraction had suddenly become inaccessible. And from what I gathered, the answers given were vague at best, evasive at worst. I took no pleasure in any of that, honestly. I didn't do any of this to ruin anyone's day. I did it because I had spent months being polite, being patient, and being completely ignored. And I had finally reached the point where the only language that seemed to register was the language of consequences. In the weeks that followed, something shifted. Whether it was the bad publicity within the neighborhood, the mounting legal pressure from Patricia's office, or simply the realization that I wasn't going to quietly fade away, the HOA board finally agreed to a resolution. They agreed, in writing, to remove the playground equipment, restore the easement strip to its original condition, and formally acknowledge in board meeting minutes that the easement scope was limited strictly to maintenance access for the retention pond. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue further legal action for the unauthorized construction or for the buried electrical line that had been run without my permission, provided everything was removed and restored within 60 days. Negotiating the specifics of that agreement wasn't entirely smooth, even after the board signaled their willingness to settle. There was a tense back and forth over who would bear the cost of restoration, with the board initially suggesting I should split expenses since I would supposedly benefit from having the land returned to its natural state. Patricia firmly rejected that framing in her response, pointing out that I never asked for the land to be altered in the first place, and that the cost of undoing an unauthorized improvement falls squarely on the party who built it without permission. The board eventually conceded the point, though not without another round of grumbling emails from Gary Pruitt about how everyone was just trying to make the best of an unfortunate situation. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters. Throughout this entire ordeal, several neighbors reached out to me, not to criticize, but to share their own frustrations with how the HOA operated. I learned I wasn't the only property owner who'd had boundaries crossed, decisions made without consultation, or concerns waved away with vague promises. One neighbor told me about a fence dispute that had dragged on for over a year. Another mentioned an assessment increase that had been pushed through without proper notice to homeowners. It became clear to me that what happened on my property wasn't an isolated incident of overreach. It was a pattern, and in some strange way, my willingness to push back gave a few other people the confidence to start asking harder questions of their own board. The playground equipment came down about 6 weeks after our agreement. I watched the same men in matching polo shirts dismantle the swing sets, load up the rubber mulch, and haul the picnic pavilion away piece by piece. There was no apology, not really, just a kind of quiet, grudging compliance, the sort that comes from people who know they're legally cornered rather than people who've genuinely reflected on what they did wrong. I didn't need an apology, though. I needed my land respected, and that, finally, is what I got. A new playground was eventually built, I heard, on actual HOA-owned common land about half a mile from my property, land the association legitimately controlled, with no easement complications and no confused property lines. From what I understand, it turned out better than the original anyway, with proper permitting and a real construction budget instead of a rushed, defensive build thrown together to win a property dispute. Funny how doing things the right way the first time tends to work out better for everyone involved. As for the access road, I did eventually agree to broaden its use slightly, allowing HOA maintenance vehicles reasonable access for the retention pond, along with occasional emergency access if ever needed, formalized in a clear written agreement reviewed by both my attorney and theirs. What I didn't agree to, and never will, is any future construction, recreational use, or assumption that an easement for access somehow translates into an open invitation to use my land however they please. Looking back on the whole situation now, almost a year later, I think about what I'd tell someone going through something similar. First, read your title work and easement documents the moment you buy property, not after a dispute forces you to. Second, document everything from the very beginning. Every conversation, every email, every photo of equipment being installed on land that isn't theirs. Third, get a real estate attorney involved early. I lost valuable leverage in those first few weeks by trying to handle things informally, assuming reasonable people would behave reasonably. And fourth, and maybe most importantly, don't let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting what's legally yours. Carol Whitfield tried to frame this as me being the villain in a story about children losing their playground. The truth was always much simpler. I was a property owner whose land had been used without permission, who tried for months to resolve things peacefully, and who only took firm action when every reasonable alternative had been exhausted. HOAs exist in theory to maintain shared standards and protect property values for everyone in a community. But theory and practice don't always align, and when a board starts believing that good intentions or community goodwill can override actual property law, it falls on individual homeowners to draw that line clearly. I didn't enjoy closing that gate on festival day. I didn't enjoy watching confused families turn their cars around or seeing Carol Whitfield's face when she realized I wasn't bluffing. But I also didn't enjoy watching my land get trenched, paved with rubber mulch, and turned into someone else's amenity without so much as a conversation first. In the end, the resolution was fair to everyone. The HOA got their playground, just on land that actually belonged to them. The families of Maple Ridge Estates got a properly built, properly permitted space for their kids. And I got my land back, along with a clearly documented, legally sound agreement that protects me from this ever happening again. Sometimes the right outcome doesn't come from anger or revenge. It comes from patience, documentation, good legal counsel, and the willingness to enforce a boundary even when people try to make you feel small for having one in the first place. That gate is still there today, quiet and unremarkable most days of the year, except for the occasional maintenance truck that rolls through to check on the retention pond, exactly as the original easement always intended. Every time I see it, I'm reminded that property rights aren't just abstract legal concepts. They're the foundation that lets neighbors coexist peacefully, precisely because everyone knows where the lines are, and precisely because those lines are respected, not redrawn by whoever happens to have the loudest committee and the most matching polo shirts.